Okay, picture this for a second. You are a hunter-gatherer living roughly 13,000 years ago. There are zero supermarkets, zero refrigerators, and you have literally been walking all day long. You live in a cave in what will eventually become Israel, and one afternoon, someone in your group comes across some wild grain. Now, this grain has been sitting out in a wet stone mortar for, well, just a little too long. It smells super weird. It looks kind of bubbly. Clearly, something biological and completely mysterious has happened to it. And yet, for reasons that seem to completely defy all basic logic and survival instincts, someone decides to just drink it anyway. That reckless, magnificent choice right there. It might have actually been the single most important moment in human history. It kicked off a massive chain reaction that quite literally shaped civilization, agriculture, and human society as we know it. In this explainer, we are going to uncover the genuinely mind-blowing history of alcohol. So, let's dive right in. Now, to really wrap our heads around our relationship with alcohol, we actually have to start with a number that should absolutely stop you in your tracks. 10 million. 10 million years ago. This is long before Homo sapiens even existed. You see, when people ask if human beings were biologically designed to handle alcohol, the answer is actually a resounding yes. But here's the catch. That biological foundation did not start with human brewers. Humans, along with our close primate relatives, share this very specific enzyme called ADH4, and what it does is break down ethanol with surprising efficiency. That specific mutation emerged 10 million years ago, right about the time our distant ancestors were transitioning from living in the trees down to the ground. So you're probably wondering, why on earth did we develop that enzyme? Well, a biologist named Robert Dudley spent 25 years studying this exact thing, and he came up with something he calls the drunken monkey hypothesis. For millions of years, perfectly ripe fruit out in the wild would naturally ferment, which produced trace amounts of ethanol. Because of this, the smell of alcohol wasn't some warning sign to stay away, it was actually a beacon. It was like a giant neon sign signaling maximum sweetness and high survival calories. The primates who followed that scent survived longer, and then they passed that genetic preference down. So natural selection literally hardwired our nervous systems to seek out the smell of booze just to survive. And hey, this isn't just some abstract eerie. We can actually see this happening in the wild today. Down in Panama, researchers found that wild spider monkeys actively seek out fruit containing 1 to 2% alcohol, and their urine proves they're actually metabolizing it. Over in the Ivory Coast, there was a parallel study showing that wild chimpanzees consume the equivalent of a human drink or two every single day, and they're doing this completely by accident, just by eating their normal diet. It turns out our ancestors were getting a mild buzz in the forest millions of years before anyone ever intentionally brewed a single drop. But, stumbling upon fermented fruit by accident is one thing. Making it on purpose, that requires an absolutely enormous cognitive leap. You need observation, memory, and, frankly, early science. The oldest confirmed evidence we have of deliberate brewing takes us back 13,000 years to Rakafakav in Israel. This is where we find the Natufians. They were a sophisticated, semi-nomadic group of hunter-gatherers who buried their dead with flowers. They left behind these large, beautifully carved stone mortars, and deep inside those mortars, archaeologists found 13,000-year-old microscopic residue. Now, that residue, it gave us unambiguous proof that they were actually brewing beer from wild wheat and barley. And it wasn't just a happy accident. This was an astonishingly complex 3-stage brewing process. First, they were malting the grain, which means germinating it in water. Second, they mashed and heated it. And third, they left it out to ferment using wild airborne yeast. This absolutely was not some random puddle of mush. This was a technically sophisticated, intentional brewing operation being run by people who literally lived in caves. And right here is where we hit a crucial twist. The Natufians were not farmers. Agriculture, as we know it, did not exist yet. They were gathering wild grain specifically to brew beer for rituals. This detail fuels one of archaeology's most fascinating and hotly debated questions, one championed by Brian Hayden. The question is this: did humans invent farming for bread, or did we invent it for beer? Think about it. Did we endure the back-breaking, relentless labor of early agriculture just for food, or was it to guarantee a reliable surplus of a sacred, calorie-dense, safe-to-drink intoxicant? The desire to make alcohol demonstrably comes before organized farming, and once that spark of discovery was lit, man, it spread like wildfire. If we sweep across the globe around 9,000 years ago in Jiahu, China, we see evidence of an ancient mixed cocktail made of rice, honey, and fruit. In Kyoto, China, right around the same time, they were using mold-based fermentation starters, which is a seriously complex technique that is still used today.
Meanwhile, 8,000 years ago, over in Gadatreli Gora, Georgia, we find the earliest chemically confirmed grape wine. The crazy part? None of these cultures were trading recipes with each other. They all discovered fermentation entirely independently. It really just proves that, at our core, we are fundamentally and incurably fermentation-curious species.
Eventually, this little biological quirk we developed evolved into a massive socio-economic institution. Fast forward to 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, that's the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, home to the Sumerians and the Babylonians. This is when and where writing was invented. And, perhaps not coincidentally at all, some of the very first things human beings ever bothered to write down were administrative records about beer. Beer was essentially the social fabric of Mesopotamia. It wasn't just a nice drink to have with dinner, it was the literal payroll system. Laborers who were out there building temples received about 2 liters of beer a day as their standard daily wage. It functioned as standard currency. It was used as medicine. They even provisioned their dead with beer, working under the very practical assumption that being in the afterlife was absolutely no excuse to miss your daily ration. The Babylonians ultimately went on to document at least 70 different varieties of beer, light, dark, spiced, honey-infused. They essentially created a massive taxonomy of alcohol right at the very dawn of human civilization. I mean, the Sumerians loved beer with such absolute sincerity that they created a major deity just to embody it. Enter Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer, and her name magnificently translates to the lady who fills the mouth. She wasn't just some minor background figure either. She was the daughter of the creator god. Her domain wasn't viewed merely as a beverage. It represented the entire civilizing power that fermented grain brought to their entire society.
And that intense devotion gave us one of the most extraordinary documents of the ancient world. Around 1800 BCE, an anonymous poet carved the hymn to Ninkasi onto clay tablets. On the surface, it's this beautiful, sweeping religious declaration of love for a goddess. But here is the genius part. It brilliantly doubles as a highly precise, step-by-step brewing recipe. It details baking bapir bread, soaking it, fermenting the mixture, and finally filtering the liquid through a woven basket. The detail in that hymn is so exact that, believe it or not, we actually know what it tastes like. Get this. In 1989, Fritz Maytag, who founded Anchor Brewing in San Francisco, successfully recreated the recipe. At a meeting for microbrewers, everyone actually drank it exactly the way the Sumerians would have, sipping it from clay jugs through these long straws. The final brew came out to about 3.5% alcohol by volume, and people said it tasted a lot like champagne mixed with dates. 3,800 years after that clay tablet was carved, the recipe still worked perfectly. That right there is a huge testament to the absolute resilience and precision of ancient brewing. And make no mistake, Mesopotamians took the quality of this ancient brew incredibly seriously. Just look at the Code of Hammurabi, which dates to around 1754 BCE. It is one of humanity's oldest surviving written legal codes. And right there, smack in the middle of the laws, it strictly regulates tavern pricing and quality. If you were a tavern owner and you got caught watering down your beer, the legal punishment was literally being thrown into the river. Humanity's very first great legal system prioritized consumer protection for beer above almost anything else. Clearly, we have always known what matters most. Now, if we travel over to ancient Egypt, we see them operating this really fascinating 2-tier system of alcohol. On one hand, you had beer for the everyday workers. It was thick, it was highly nutritious, and because of the fermentation, it was naturally antimicrobial. It was genuinely much safer than drinking straight from the Nile. The massive labor forces that built the pyramids were paid in rations of it. So for them, beer was essentially public health infrastructure. On the other hand, though, you had wine. Wine was pure elite prestige. It was reserved for high ceremony, offerings for the gods, and the pharaohs. In fact, sealed royal tombs feature these wine jars that have incredibly detailed vintage labels on them, literally noting the year, the specific vineyard, and the chief vintner. When you pull all of these archaeological threads together, a really profound pattern starts to emerge. The Natufians, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the ancient Chinese. From the very beginning of our history, alcohol was never, ever just about kicking back and relaxing after a long day of foraging. It was consistently used to bridge the gap between the living and the afterlife. It was deeply tied to ritual, to the sacred, to death, and to binding entire communities together. For early humans, it represented a very real doorway to step outside ordinary boundaries and touch something much larger than themselves. So what does this all mean for us today? Well, the next time you see a glass of wine or a pint of beer, I want you to consider the staggering weight of history sloshing around inside it.
you aren't just having a drink. You were actually holding a 13,000-year-old tradition of human ingenuity, one that was born in a cave to honor the dead. And even deeper behind that, you were actively participating in a 10-million-year-old unbroken biological chain, tracing all the way back to wild primates surviving in the forest. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope this completely changes how you look at human history.